Good morning. I'm Maureen Scott, the Events and Activities Coordinator for the Learning Resource Center South. I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Strength-Based IEPs with Drs. Michelle Damiani and Brent Elder. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Learning Resource Center South at Rowan University, a partnership with New Jersey Department of Education, Office of Special Education. We are proud to be a part of the Learning Resource Centers network, which includes 3 centers in New Jersey, South, Central, and North. The Learning Resource Centers foster achievement of all students with disabilities, their families, and the educational professionals who work with them as they pursue the goal of increasing opportunities and improving educational outcomes in special education. Please check the chat box for links to the LRC-South's website and the LRC network to find a center near you. To get started, I'd like to go over a few things about the setup for today's webinar. Today's presentation is being recorded and all attendees will be sent a link to view the recorded presentation. Closed captioning will be available on the recorded version. As webinar attendees, you are in listen and view only mode. This means your audio is muted and your image will not show, but we do want to hear from you. We will be using both the chat and the Q&A features. The chat feature is enabled for use by all. We will be sharing links out via the chat box. Please make sure your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. Our presenters plan to address the questions periodically as we move through the presentation, so please send questions in as you think of them. Your feedback is valuable to us, so we ask that you please complete the survey at the end of the webinar. Your input lets us know how we're doing and guides our future plans. You will need to complete the survey in order to receive a certificate of completion. Please allow 1 week from completion of the survey for the certificate to be emailed to you. And now, a little introduction about our presenters. Today's presenters are Dr. Michelle Damiani and Dr. Brent Elder. Dr. Damiani is an assistant professor of inclusive education in the Interdisciplinary and Inclusive Education Department at Rowan University. In her research, she uses a disability studies and education framework to understand the experiences of educators with disabilities and to examine disability as an aspect of diversity in the teacher workforce that contributes to our understanding of teachers' pedagogical approaches and expanding inclusive practices. Dr. Brent Elder is also an assistant professor in the Interdisciplinary and Inclusive Education Department. His research and practice focuses on the development of sustainable inclusive education practices in under-resourced schools in the United States and the low and middle income countries around the world. Please check the chat box for links to more detailed bios on both of our presenters. And now, I'm very happy to introduce you all to both Drs. Michelle Damiani and Brent Elder.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our web series. So again, Michelle and Brent.
Hello, everyone.
And we look forward to moving forward with you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So as you know, we'll be talking about strength-based IEPs. And like Maureen just said, just a reminder, as we are talking about materials that we'll be referencing throughout this webinar, there's a link to our Google Drive with participant materials. So everything that we reference, we'll click on links so that you can see them on the screen, but they'll also be provided in the chat feature.
So this is an overview of today's agenda. In this introductory webinar, we're going to be talking about distance learning and IEPs, strength-based approaches. We'll be doing a student vignette activity, talking about person-centered planning, talking about PLAFSP IEP goals, action plan meetings, fastbacks, and IEP matrices. And so many of these are tools that you'll potentially have an opportunity to interact with and to use in the future. So as we're introducing these tools and you're thinking about how that might work for you, think about which of these tools you might want to delve further into.
And I just want to add, these are all tools, and when these tools are used together, they help create a well-oiled machine for inclusive practices. So today, the description. So let me move this around. There we go. Building on the introductory module to strength-based approaches, activities in the session include reviewing and critiquing strength-based and deficit-based examples in IEPs, and some initial practice with writing about students with disabilities in strength-based ways. Next, participants will be introduced to a variety of approaches and tools they can use in their own practices to promote strength-based approaches to writing IEPs. These include, as Michelle mentioned, person-centered planning, writing PLAFs and benchmarking IEP goals, the implementation of action plan meetings, developing IEP matrices, and utilizing classroom checklists and strategies that promote ongoing strength-based practices and inclusive education. We will give consideration to the needs of IEP writing and the delivery of special education services and distance learning.
Okay, and as promised, in light of the pandemic and the need for education to shift to remote collaboration, we did want to address strength-based IEP writing in this context as well. We mentioned the tip sheet, and we wanted to familiarize you with some of the resources that you have here. And so through the PowerPoint, if you click on that link for virtual IEP meeting webpage, that will bring you to a website, or that is a resource of the Parent Hub, the Parent Information Center. And at the top, you see in these bullet points that you have tip sheets that include a sample agenda for virtual IEP meeting, both in English and Spanish, technology tips for all participants, suggestions for hosting a virtual meeting, tips for participating in the virtual meeting, and then infographics about virtual IEP meetings. Again, both accessible in English and Spanish. This provides a nice little summary of some of the tools that are available to you at this website. And we encourage you to check them out for your individual needs. As we know, IEP meetings and things, right, that still needs to happen, and that's moved to the virtual space. And so planning for that in terms of access and equity is really important. If you scroll down on that page, it'll bring you to, yep, right there. Virtual IEP meetings tip sheet. You can download that in PDF format, Word format. And this is a 6-page tool sheet, so many ideas for you there, but not hopefully overly cumbersome. And as you see, as you scroll down, there's some of the infographics, there's the meeting information, you know, some kind of tips and do's and don'ts, and hopefully those will be easy access resources. Also from that original webpage where you access the tool tip sheet, I wanted to call your attention to another resource, a sample virtual IEP meeting agenda. And so when you look at the agenda here, really simple, but talks about different roles, having the different roles, meeting norms, both in terms of supporting access to technology and participation. On that tip sheet, there are ideas for schools and families that don't have access or reliable access to the internet, and so thinking about how to do those calls and phone conference and things, and then some steps for the meeting. And we wanted to call your attention to the steps because they're set up in terms of organization and documentation, similarly to maybe some of the things you're going to hear us talk about, as well as recognizing that you want to be reviewing and engaging with the students' present levels of performance and their measurable annual goals. And so as we're thinking about how to make these more strength-based and incorporating them in the IEP, we want to make sure that that comes through to families in virtual IEP meetings as well.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And so we want to call your attention to the article that me, Michelle, and our colleague, Dr. Carrie Rood of SUNY Cortland in New York, we wrote. All three of us went to graduate school together at Syracuse University, and all three of us were special education teachers, inclusive educators. And as we all became friends and colleagues, we were sharing ideas about things that we came across that kind of made us cringe as special educators about deficit-based writing in IEPs, whether we inherited IEP goals or IEPs that were like, oh, you know, we'll give you some examples in a minute. And so we wrote this article that we'll be referencing throughout this presentation, where you can either take different sections of the article and do a deeper dive for yourself. We'll be referencing these vignettes, but this article can be used holistically, or you can break it into different parts like action planning, running action planning meetings, strength-based IEP writing, things like that. So it's a tool that we'll be referencing throughout this presentation, but just know that you have that at your fingertips, and this is hyperlinked throughout. The next piece here. This article really came from some language that me and Michelle and our colleague Carrie came across frequently. We would inherit IEPs that would say things like this first example here. Martha is a 16-year-old with an IEP who attends a self-contained special education classroom at her public high school. She is a runner, she is defiant, she is low, and has a label of intellectual disability. And one thing that I notice a lot of when I'm working in schools in New Jersey is I hear a lot of the students really high, the students really low, and oftentimes this language is used in front of students themselves. And so typically if we were face-to-face, I would ask during this professional development, who else hears this language or receives this language in IEPs, and we would unpack this a little bit. But the main point I want to talk about here is when we have these sorts of labels of kids, they're a runner, they're defiant, these are in responses to unmet needs in the environment, right? And so we're going to challenge you to think about this differently. So instead of saying she is a runner, we can say, in order to stay safely in class, Martha requires the following supports, right? And so we're going to try to flip all the deficit-based language into strength-based language, where we remind ourselves as educators, the onus is on us to provide supports for the student. If the student is defiant, well, they may not understand the rules, right? And so we need to provide clearer supports, and we have to have a team thinking about how to change these sorts of deficit-based approaches and think of productive ways that tell us what we can do to support these students. So instead of having this example like Martha, this deficit-based approach, we want to try to flip our perspectives to strength-based. So this example here with Ashley. Ashley is a 14-year-old who loves pop music, hands-on learning activities, and anything related to technology. She has labels of cerebral palsy and autism. She has a lot of friends and has been fully included since second grade. So this tells us that she loves pop music. So maybe we can infuse that into language arts or math. Certainly hands-on activities are good for more than just Ashley. So thinking of ways to make content more engaging across the board and using technology, right? So it gives us a fighting chance to be able to support students in strength-based ways. And it constructs students as positive students that can contribute to class, rather than saying she's a runner. That can be really scary for teachers. And so it constructs students as strength-based.
Okay, so now we're going to look at an example of Franklin. And so you heard Brent gave us examples from Martha and Ashley, two different students and two very different ways of writing about them. And so here we're going to think about a student named Franklin. So this vignette draws on an example of a real student in our experience, of course, with a pseudonym. And so I'll just read you briefly this description of Franklin. Franklin has a hard time comprehending and recalling information from a text. Because of these difficulties, Franklin often has difficulty recalling information from both independent reading books and books read aloud to the class. And so I'm already wondering how many people are thinking, I've heard something like that. I've seen descriptions like that. The IEP that I'm looking at, the student that I'm thinking about, it's written that way, right? And what I would ask you right now at this moment, and please feel free to drop your reactions in the chat. We want you to engage with us here. We want to hear what you're thinking. What do you know about Franklin based on this first clip? Feel free to drop anything in the chat. It's not a trick question. What do you know so far? Imagine that you're informed, your principal informs you that you're getting a new student tomorrow. And it's Franklin. What do you know about Franklin? What do you know about how he learns? What expectations do you have for him based on this description? And so I'm going to pause for a moment and give folks a chance to react in the chat. Feel free to keep typing if you are responding in the chat. I'm starting to see things about folks would like more information. They're going to ask, would like to ask for more information. They'd like to know, are there any recent evals or any more information available? Folks are pointing to that the recall and the comprehension piece is focusing on the difficulty. We're saying we don't know anything about him. We just know what he can't do. We don't know what his interests are. What are Franklin's interests? Great questions. And so we see here, right? That's exactly right. What do we know about him? Not a lot. And probably based on this, we have more questions than answers. And we probably don't know what expectations to have for him. Although if met only with this information, we risk them being very low because we know very little about what he can do and only what he can't do. And so again, an actual student description, here's the same student with a very, very different description. And I'm going to ask you the same questions. You know, you're getting the student in your class tomorrow. This is the information that you have. What do you know about Franklin? Here's what you receive. Franklin often has difficulty recalling information from both independent reading books and books read aloud to the class. For example, when prompted by saying, did blank happen in the story? Franklin often guesses and is unclear if he comprehended what occurred in the story. However, when Franklin is given a graphic organizer to write down key aspects of the story and a peer buddy, he's able to more easily recall and pull out relevant textual information. When these supports are paired with a text of his choice, such as a book on the subject that he is more interested in, he's able to pull out key events and details of the text with little adult assistance. Okay, and so this is a segment of his PLAF. But now I'll ask you again, drop into the chat, you know, this even from this limited description. What do you know about Franklin? What are your expectations for him? And what do you still want to know if you're thinking of that as well? So ideas that I'm starting to see coming through here. We know about some tools that work for him. We know that maybe we can start using graphic organizers. We know what helps him improve recall and comprehension, even though those are still things that he is, you know, working on, that we're going to try and give him some choice of reading material. Someone still wants to know what is his independent reading level, right? So we don't start him at something frustrational or something too easy or way too difficult. We want him to be successful. But already what I'm seeing, even in this brief thread, is in the beginning you knew very little, and you weren't comfortable saying much more than I don't know anything really, or I don't know much other than his weaknesses. And in the second example, right, I'm imagining if I'm a teacher and I'm getting this student tomorrow, I have a place to start, right? I have an idea of what works for Franklin. I have an idea about the supports that he needs. Just checking the chat. Want to know how he emotionally responds to not comprehending. What does he do that makes him feel good, right? So we're asking different questions. Even in the first part, we were really asking more about, like, what does the eval say, or what kind of information do we have there? We're asking questions about Franklin as a person now, and how he interacts and responds to the learning experience. And that is going to help us write about Franklin in a strength-based way that both acknowledges his needs and supports his areas, that acknowledges and supports his areas of need, but also draws in the things that we know about Franklin. And all of the kinds of things that you're bringing up, right? His interests, giving choice, using tools like the graphic organizer, as well as better understanding Franklin as a student. And I love that you're pointing to his emotional response to that learning as well. So really big difference, right? And, you know, just think for a moment, what are the IEPs primarily, maybe either that you've received, or, you know, how do they look? Do they look more like Franklin's first example, or do they look more like Franklin's second example? Or are they somewhere in the middle? And what we're going to really be asking you to think about, right? Today, we're going to be introducing various tools that can support you in developing more strength-based approaches. But throughout IEPs, as we're writing about students, we have to think about how we're constructing students. And that leads us to the next slide.
Okay.
So this is an opportunity for us to discuss. Some of these questions we have already started to answer, right? But I'm thinking too, right? We don't have to answer all of these now, but these are things for you to be thinking about. And I love that you pointed to how each situation approaches him. What influences do you think the two approaches will have on the lives of the students and their family? But I'm really, Brent and I are really most interested right now, if you want to drop something in the chat, is which scenario best represents what you experience at your school? What are you seeing in practice? You know, how are you seeing IEPs written? What's happening in your schools? Okay. And thank you so much for your engagement in the chat. Feel free to keep using this chat feature. So I'm seeing a couple things come up in the chat. Folks are saying it is more common to see the first example. And unfortunately, that's true, right? And that is something that we need to shift in practice. Someone else said we're now using data-driven information to put into our IEPs, and we're going to be talking about that more too. We're going to be talking about goals, and we're going to be talking about various aspects of the IEP. But if we just think about those first two, right, that the first one is more common, that the deficit-based can't do, difficulty with, and is more common. We already see how students are being constructed, right? And narratives like that construct fear. Fear around students, fear around what you might experience with that. And so it also pathologizes the student as the problem rather than, right, whatever task it is that we're working on. And so, you know, reading comprehension, for example, right? Is the difficulty with recalling information, right? Is it Franklin that's the problem? Is it the task that's the problem? We want to shift that so that we're pulling it away, that the student is not the problem, that it's that what we're seeing and experiencing in terms of what isn't working, as Brent said, is a result of an unmet need. And so we need to shift the environment, the resources, what we know about the student, to better support them so that we can address that unmet need, and or be clear about what the student needs in a particular environment to support success. And to the data-driven piece, we'll also be talking about that too. Really, really important to have observable, measurable opportunities for data-driven progress so that we can make sure that all students have the opportunity to achieve challenging objectives, which we mentioned in the introduction, which we now know is much more of a focus as a result of the Andrew decision.
One thing I want to add here too is changing our language doesn't require permission, right? We can write IEPs in this way if we so choose. It doesn't cost money. This perspective shift doesn't take anything. It is something you can model for others. You can model for your administrator. If you're an administrator, you can require that this is the shift you make in your schools. You can encourage this with parents. You know, that sort of thing doesn't require any. It's free, right? It's easy to do. And if you wanted to do a deeper dive with this in the part 3 of this webinar series, you could edit your IEP, for example, or an IEP that you've received, you can edit some language. Other things that we'll talk about later may require some district structural kind of negotiations, but we'll talk about that more as we go. So we're going to give you a vignette, and we're going to ask you to reword some deficit-based language. And Michelle, if you could also moderate the chat feature for this example too. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. So with this vignette, this is again kind of a conglomeration of me and Carrie and Michelle's students. So Michael is in 6th grade. He has good verbal skills and can count objects up to 15. He knows the first 15 language arts, Dolch sight words, and loves to look at books with colorful pictures. He is a tactile and visual learner. He likes to work in small groups. He has a label of intellectual disability and screams at and hits others when frustrated. He can be extremely disruptive in class. So here you sort of have a mix of language. I would like for you to take a quick second and in the chat feature, think about things that you might reword in this. Things that that kind of make you take pause and go, oh, we should maybe be thinking differently about that. And Michelle will help call out some of the things that we see in the chat. What are some things that you're noticing, Michelle? What are some things in the chat?
So yeah, I just want to comment on some great ideas coming up in the chat. Just worth repeating some of them here. You know, the first reaction was that extremely disruptive is hurting my heart, and I think that that's a really important reaction for us to sit with, right? Is that we see this all the time, and we almost become it seems too common that we see something like that, right? Student is extremely disruptive. And so as the chat continues, we have rewording to explain what that looks like, right? And even that, as we reword that, we have to think about how we word that. and the nature of someone else describing the situations that are frustrating for him and the strategies that reduce frustration. And so doing that is exactly what will allow us to understand, right, what in the environment is not working for Michael, and strategies to support him, which also gives us a better opportunity to proactively respond to the student's needs, to prevent, right, that perceived disruption from happening, and to better support so that the student doesn't experience that, and when they do experience frustration, that we know how to respond to that, or that we know some things that work for this student. And so, yes, yeah, thank you for these. The last two sentences. So I'm going to continue to look at these ideas in the chat. You're absolutely right. You're asking for more information. You're asking us to redefine extremely disruptive, and we have some ideas. How might you rewrite this? I know we don't know a lot about Michael yet, but I mean, just based on this, how might you rewrite that? What's something we could say?
Yeah, that's the next prompt is,
okay.
So just throw out some ideas. So instead of saying he is extremely disruptive in class, again, think about flipping that on its head, right? So Michael works calmly in class when, right? So flip that and let's see some ideas in the chat about the screaming and the hitting and the disruptive language. How might we flip that?
And I just want to point out that one of your colleagues said, I don't think it's necessary to include the student's eligibility classification category in this section, especially since it's likely noted in other parts of the IEP. And that's a really important comment, right? Because that shifts the focus to the disability and the disability label and perceived characteristics about a disability rather than Michael.
And we also want to point out here, this is typically a point of comment when we do this in person. When we say he has a label of intellectual disability, we're saying that that label is subjective, right? When a student falls outside of the norm of whatever norm we think a norm is, then we say, oh, they must be labeled as having an intellectual disability or autistic or whatever. So what we're saying is when we say they have a label of, we're acknowledging that we place labels on students that that students are not inherently something that we label them, right? We're acknowledging that that's socially kind of constructed.
So Brent, if it's okay with you, I think we'll pause for maybe 20 seconds or so and let them respond. I think we've caught up to the chat. Let them respond about how would you turn that on its head, even with what little you know right now, right? How might you describe this? Great ideas coming through in terms of the things that need to be shifted or described differently. What's an example of how you might do it? So we have some ideas coming in. In building off of he's a tactile and visual learner, he likes to work in small groups. There's a suggestion, we could add things like Michael works best when working in small groups, using a choice board to determine what he is working for, colorful pictures, a sensory break. And noting things that have caused Michael frustration. And I think that's important, right? We need to recognize what things in the academic environment are causing a student stress and frustration. We can't ignore those things. We need to address those things. What strategies have been successful in reducing the frustration, and then what is helpful so that he does not experience that frustration. So even without knowing Michael, we want to put something in there that, rather than this idea of him screaming and hitting, we can say something like, right, these kinds of environments, tasks, settings, whatever it is, are really challenging for Michael.
Things I might,
or could be. Go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, things I would expect to see here would be like, when given a visual schedule that's predictable and reminders of when things will change, Michael, like, you know, things that promote Michael's to stay calm in class, a visual schedule, a countdown for when things will change, working with a preferred partner, having a checklist of when things are going to start and end, you know, those types of things, because then that gives us a fighting chance when we receive this information from another teacher or another school. If you have your paraprofessionals read this, you say, oh, look, there's some strategies right here that can help keep Michael calm. We can intuit that he might not always be calm if he doesn't have those supports, right? So we're not saying that he doesn't have support needs or challenges, but we're saying, you know, to minimize those disruptions, we're acknowledging those disruptions, but saying it in a strength-based way. We don't want to say we're just ignoring the complexities or the needs of children. What we're saying is that it is up to us to provide workable strategies. And that's a simple thing. Like, the more, and we'll talk more about this with other tools that we'll present, but the more transparent we are about what works for kids or young adults, whatever, then they have a stronger chance to be successful in the inclusive environment. All right, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna move forward. So what we did here is what I would like for you to do, again with the chat feature, is now that we're thinking about Michael and things that when we're reconstructing how he, you know, in strength-based ways, what are some activities that might make Michael more successful in the inclusive setting? So thinking of him being screaming or being disruptive and hitting, what are some activities that might promote Michael's success in inclusive setting? And if you just put it could just be something like visual schedule in the chat, something that might be promote the success of Michael. What are some ideas? You have some ideas popping up, Michelle?
Yep, we have some ideas coming in about first then visual, first then board for work completion, using a timer, frequent reinforcer inventories, sensory breaks, but describe the type, visual cues, timers, using small groups, peer mentoring, breaking activities into shorter activities or chunks, taking breaks, providing positive feedback, you know, working with peers, given that Michael works well in that structure, having several books available for Michael to read or review, allowing for some of that choice. Lots of ideas coming in. So already we have 5 to 7 ideas there, right?
And one thing I want to impress upon here is these are all wonderful ideas, right? And so when we have a collaborative teaming approach to inclusion, whether that's co-teaching or not, or grade level planning, these are ideas that are great for all kids too. Oftentimes things that are good for special education are good for everybody. English language learners, kids without identified disabilities, all of that stuff. So, you know, peer supports that rotate through the whole class, right? So those are some ideas, and it's always great to have this sort of, special educators have all these ideas that just flow off their, the top of their heads. So thank you for that. So Michelle, I'm going to move on to the next piece.
Okay. And so, you know, we've been talking about student examples, things that we see in the field, some of the, as we're moving into considerations of what we're going to do in practice. In the introduction, we talked a little bit about inclusive education as social justice. And that is a really critical and fundamental part of being able to see students as capable and competent learners, and then being able to utilize strength-based approaches for students that are going to support them, challenging what has been a very deficit-based system. Right, special education historically has been a very deficit-based system, and so when we recognize inclusive education as a social justice issue, that further gives us a frame and a way to not only talk about and think about students, but then, as Brent said, right, this doesn't cost anything. We can write about students in holistic, more just ways right away. And so we want to give you an opportunity to think about that social justice piece, particularly as it applies to inclusive education, a little bit further and a little bit more in depth. So what we have here is, it's a one-page article by Unok Marks. So the link should be dropping into the chat. If you are having trouble seeing the chat, again, I know there's been a couple posts, make sure that your settings are set to all panelists and attendees, so that you're seeing everybody's comments and the LRC team's posts regarding the links. So this link should be available to you in the chat. If for some reason you don't see the link directly in the chat, this is in your participant materials folder. It's the resource number 3, Unok Marks. And the title of this article is Special Education, More About Social Justice, Less About Caring. The article looks like this. We know you can't read this on screen, so please do access that where either through the folder or the link in the chat. And what we usually do with this article is a strategy, an interactive strategy called Say Something. And so what we're going to ask you to do is to read the first 2 columns, right? There are 4 columns on this first page. Just read the first 2 columns, and then we want you to react to that. Please feel free to react by dropping a comment in the chat. Feel free to jot down your ideas. If we were working in person, we would have you maybe turn and talk to someone near you or a small group. But for right now, read those first 2 articles and then react. I'm sorry, read those first 2 columns and then react. And we'll give you a few moments to read and respond.
And this is modeling an inclusive strategy. It's transparent pedagogy. So if you've had a few minutes to read the columns, do we have anything popping up?
Just first comment coming up now. So feel free to keep responding. Okay, so we have some ideas coming up. I can relate when the author discusses others' reactions to her profession, and I can't relate to students being separated from their peers in the classroom, as our district makes a point to really try to include all students. However, there might be some, but usually a small percentage. And then we have another comment that says, it seems infantilizing of students and adults with disabilities. The focus on caring and patience doesn't lead to the development of independence of students and adults with disabilities. Hey, I understand what she's saying. However, I have the opposite reaction, because being patient and caring in the true sense of those words are highly coveted qualities that can only lead to putting the person first. Unfortunately, historically, those words have been misused with connotations and actions other than what they should be.
Yeah, and being caring and patient is important for anybody working with kids, or, you know, in any, in teaching profession.
And I think Brent and I will respond, and we'll try and pull these ideas in a minute. But so now just finish up the last column and a half, and then say something again. And so if you're saying something still from the first column that you wanted to share, or reacting to the second column, either one is fine. But we want to give you another chance to react and respond, and then we'll talk a little bit about these ideas. So we'll give you maybe a minute and see where we are. try and finish up in about 15 seconds or so. Feel free to drop things in the chat. If I see them coming in, we'll give a pause so that we can read those. So in this article, you said it's more about social justice and less about caring, and as Unok Marx tells us. And we already have some common themes and then some differences in our chat reaction. And so we say, yes, we see some of these things, we're not sure about others. We're asking questions about this, this role of help or caring, right? And in someone's district where they said they really do include all students, some of this is less of an issue. And that's an interesting observation, right? That kind of think back to that first introduction, where when does this become a moot point if we approach this from a perspective of this is simply our responsibilities to support students in inclusive opportunity, in inclusive classrooms. But we have other ideas coming up, right, about how infantilizing this can be for students and for teachers, and a comment about refocusing what educators do beyond caring for. And so this participant sees this occur when adults speak for children or do things for children that they can do for themselves. And so, yes, caring is important, and do we need to be patient, as Brent said, of course. But at what point does that become very patronizing, right? At what point does that shift? And I've seen that even in my own experience. I've seen that become the whole priority for a student, right? Oh, like the caring piece, or taking care, or helping. And so what I've really shifted to from caring is to empowering in my own practice. And those lead me to very different outcomes, just naturally thinking about that. If I think about this as a social justice issue, and I think about that, and I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I've had this happen to me throughout my career as an elementary special education teacher, and still as a professor, to be honest, of inclusive education. Somebody say, what do you do? Oh, I work in inclusive ed, or I'm an inclusive educator. Oh, you must be so patient, right? And so I still hear that. And this really resonates with me when I hear things like that, because it doesn't seem like a message of a positive. It does kind of seem like there's some expectation, right, for that to, in some way be some excessive kindness that I'm bestowing upon other people. It's just a very strange shift, right? And so when I hear those things, I take pause. So where's that coming from? Systemically, where's that coming from? Societally, where is that coming from? And then how is that playing out in the schools? And then, as you were saying, more importantly than educators, how does that play out for students? Because it does, right? And so when students hear that language about people assuming that, that the totality of their story as a student is that they need to be cared for, that's not a social justice perspective. But Brent, you look like you want to say something.
It ties into what you're saying right now. If this is coming from a place of pity, or
right,
we have to just teach them how to basically get by. That takes away our responsibility from teaching them academics, from modifying core curriculum and providing meaningful access points to all students. And that takes the bar of expectation from here and sets it really low. And then when you think about a social justice perspective, you have typically special ed classrooms that are disproportionately filled with students of color. And so then you also have lower expectations for students of color, which means there's higher chance of living in poverty and school to prison pipeline. All these other things can come as a result of having very low expectations for having a pity approach to disability. And so if we push back against that, even with the language that we use, we want to keep on ratcheting up those expectations while caring and supporting of kids is a really great quality, but we want to leverage that to increase the bar for academic achievement. And it keeps the onus on us, as we've been saying. So I'm piggybacking off of Michelle's, like these sort of perspectives have real consequences that we have to be thinking about. And again, Lisa Givens, thank you, debunking the pity narrative, pushing back and saying, we don't need pity, we need high expectations. And that's kind of what we're getting at.
And we also had someone say teaching skills, right? Teaching skills that lead to independence and support socialization. And so rather than one or the other, it can be a focus on both, but it's activities and skills that, and supporting independence that move us forward.
Mm-hmm. And one thing we want to point out here is we want you to, how you have this resource at your fingertips. It's really short and it's great for pushing back against these narratives at a faculty meeting or having an action plan meeting where you give this to parents and say, this informs me on my work. It's a really short and easily absorbable sort of strategy. So that's what I would like to kind of summarize as we move on to the next stuff, the next set of tools. And Jenny, yes, I see, speaks to expectations of teachers and raising the bar for administrators and teachers. So. All right, so yeah, thank you for your contributions. We're gonna move forward with the next resource here. So now we're gonna so we've been talking about strength-based language and ways to infuse that into your IEPs. The way that we're kind of gonna present these tools is a bit of like a chronological sort of piece. So say you receive a new student and you get their cumulative file and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this, right? There's a lot of deficit-based language. And the way that the article is laid out is the way that these tools are laid out here as well. So the first thing we would always encourage you to do, if possible, is to engage families in a person-centered plan. And you'll see with these tools that we present, we'll have these kind of overarching questions that we want you to be thinking about that we're not necessarily going to answer with every single tool that we present, but we'd like for you to consider these questions. Why is this important? Is this happening at your school? What are the benefits of this, of implementing this? Are there challenges? What are the first steps? Meaning, we're not suggesting that you take all of these tools and full on implement them right away with all students. But person-centered planning, how might that look in that age of COVID? How might that look if you just had one student, your most puzzling student? What if you did this with one family who is notably absent from conversations? So as we present these tools, the idea is not to get mastery on any of these, but to present them. And if one of them kind of piques your interest, if we schedule a part 3 of this professional development series, then you can take a deeper dive with me and Michelle facilitating that. And you'd actually be like, it would be like a working session. So I'm gonna that's how the rest of this PD will flow. We'll walk you through some of these tools.
So as we're preparing to, sorry, Brent,
Yep.
As we're preparing to introduce these tools, if you have questions about these tools as we're moving through, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll address things that come up right away as we can. And if there are things that we can't get to, we'll be sure to get them to them at the end. But if we're introducing a tool and you have a question, please feel free to ask that at that time.
Yep. And some of these tools you might need administrator buy-in, right? And that might be a barrier, but we can talk about some ways in which we've kind of circumnavigated that some of those barriers. So in this first one, there's many approaches to person-centered planning. The one that we present in the article on page 129 is MAPS. It's making action plans, and there's a hyperlink there. Or it's the McGill Action Planning System, McGill University out of Canada. And basically an overview of this. This is again, this is a one pager, right? It's super easy to absorb. It's not dense. It's practitioner friendly. So MAPS, it presumes that we want all students to be in the general education classroom, and that all students can be educated in that space. That inclusive education is a right, not an exception. And then we have high expectations for success, literacy, and graduation for all students. And the idea, so I've done this in many different formats, both in the United States and abroad. And it typically involves a graphic recording. So maps in a literal sense, you're creating a map. I am not artistic. So unless someone in the who we've invited to the party is artistically inclined, for me, this typically looks like there's 8 questions that we ask that I'll talk about in a second. And that means there's 8 chart papers around the room. And I ask someone to help scribe with me. And we have these headings at the top. Question number 1, what is a map? We talk about what this process is, which is very person-centered. It's a proactive way to get to know families, to take a deep dive in learning about someone that you're supporting inclusively. We talk about the story. I had a student who had significant vision impairment because of premature birth, very complex kind of entry into the world. And so the story was really important for us to get to know about this particular student. We talk about what the dream is, because if we don't, again, have a really high bar for expectations for students, so the student that I'm thinking of who had a vision impairment, his dream was to be an astronaut. And so with a vision impairment, that may be really hard, but we're not going to sit here and say, well, guess what? We're not going to value your dreams. We're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to say, great, well, he wants to be an astronaut. How can we infuse that passion of space and the planets and the solar system into everything that we do, right? We can leverage that. What is the nightmare? Parents oftentimes have a hard time thinking about this because they're so terrified of what might happen to their child if something happens to them, or they're living in survival mode. But it's important to talk about the nightmare because if we start going down a path, again, this is a proactive support. So if we stop going on our dream trajectory and start taking a crash course, we pause, and we pause with action plan meetings that we put in place, which we'll talk about later. We talk about who the person is. We talk about they're not just a set of labels or scary deficit-based, descriptions. We talk about the gifts, strengths, and talents. Again, strength-based approaches. What are their needs, right? We're not saying they don't have complexities or support needs, but we're saying in order to address this need, they need the following things provided by teachers or their IEP teams. And then what is the plan of action? If me and Michelle were facilitating this meeting, we'd say, what are we doing tomorrow? What are we doing next week, next month, 6 months, a year? And everyone has a responsibility. And we typically invite people. So I've done this at parents' houses if they feel comfortable. The reason why we try to do a non-school setting is to disrupt the power dynamics of the IEP meeting, right? When we're sitting at a table with a bunch of experts and can be very stuffy and very intimidating. Could have lawyers, could have advocates, there's all sorts of tensions. I try to do this with students who are the most puzzling to me, where I'm like, how do I support you? I need to know more. And parents really, the parents I've done this with have really appreciated it. And it's a way to see the family in their home, see what makes them tick. And if the student can be there, have them there, and have neighbors, cousins, aunts, uncles, the manager of the restaurant that they love, or whatever, right? Therapists, if there's a large team. If parents can't have a large team at their house, I've done this with parents who just said, Brent, you just come while our son's not here because he doesn't like to be talked about. So let's just have it, the stepdad and the mom, and have a short discussion. Whatever. Some parents I've worked with, parents who are migrant farm workers and they live with 4 other families. And so we had to we went to a park, right? So, we kind of, or you just do it virtually, like you take parents where they're at. But the idea is it's inclusive. You bring in a lot of stakeholders and you make a plan of action. And it can be graphic. I type it up usually. So it's a kind of foregrounds any sort of pre-IEP that informs how we write an IEP and our present levels of performance. So anyways, you have this, that's a quick overview. And if we have some information, if anyone has any questions as we go, please let me know.
And Brent, I just want to say too that, our being virtual for so many things right now kind of creates an interesting opportunity there, because we are all joining from our own maybe homes or comfortable spaces or workspaces or wherever it is that we are. And so, that's another opportunity, rather than having to pick a particular location, to be able to do this remotely with a bit more flexibility on time and less demand on location. And so that's another possibility too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And some people will say, well, Brent, I can't do this because my district doesn't allow me to go visit during non-contracted school hours, or I have too many kids to do this with, or whatever. I find even if you just reach out to a parent that you would like to be more involved or that is super interested, you can say, hey, this is something new that we're trying. Here's a one-page sheet. Would you be interested in doing this? And, let's start with one child that that you want more information, or you want to get their parents engaged more. Like one small thing, and you can even do an email exchange of, can you answer these 8 questions, right? You can pull these apart in ways that are doable, but it's up to you, right? If this tool doesn't speak to you, then maybe the next tool will. And if you have any questions about some of this stuff as we go through, just throw it in the chat. But otherwise, I'll click to the next slide.
Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about benchmarking, more so about the importance of benchmarking and goals that are going to keep pushing us forward, make sure that we have high expectations for students, that we're creating challenging opportunities for growth, and then measuring them, right? So back to the participant who mentioned the data-driven pieces. So all of this is going to come together there. We're not going to talk specifically about writing these now, but if this is something, if out of this discussion you say like, oh, the goals on this particular IEP are really outdated or not sufficient or aren't pushing a student forward or don't have these particular components, that is something you could dive into in the next session. And so first we want to think about benchmarking and creating, right, so we have annual goals and then incremental steps. Or benchmarks, and that we're looking for students to complete, and collecting data on that as we go through, right? And with the goal of accountability and making sure that we are not only expecting but assessing students for making progress. And this just gives us a continual opportunity for progress, reflection, and revision, right? And so if a student is not making progress, we need to address that. Why is that? What do we need to do? Is there support? Is there another step that we need to put in place? Is there, right, how do we need to adjust that goal so that we don't end up with stagnant goals, with goals that are just repeating, right, that aren't being met, or that don't truly meet the student's needs? Or I don't know if anybody has had this happen, but you receive an IEP where the same goal has been on there for years. Right?
IEP prison.
So, and that's right, that is really truly not what those goals are supposed to be for. And in fact, we have a responsibility and a legal responsibility to keep moving those goals forward and assessing them. So, and this is probably, right, we're all pretty familiar with that potentially, but just to remind us that this is a place on the IEP where we have an opportunity to, again, recognize strengths, infuse what works, and create goals with supports in mind that are going to move students forward, that build on strengths, but also address needs. And so if we want to go, Brent, did you want to say anything else there? Okay.
Yeah, just real quick. So thinking about Michael, and one of his goals was 15 Dolch words, sight words, right? And so if I might have an annual goal and say, Michael's going to learn 30 words. But if I'm going to benchmark that, because the skill, because Michael might need a lot of actual breakdown of the skill, having benchmarked, so every marking period, November, January, March, whatever, it helps me have a scope and sequence that I can then articulate clearly to the IEP team, especially if we have a skill, you know, like if it's 30 IEP sight words, then how do I break that down? And if it's clear for me, it's clear for the team. And so it's about clarity and transparency. So I encourage districts to have benchmarked, even if it's not mandated by the state, to break down benchmarks like this.
And it also keeps everything fluid and moving, right? So if something's met, we can move, we can adjust it, we can increase the goal, the expectation, whatever it is that we need to provide, right? More challenging opportunities, provide more support. It's a support to us too. And so we're just thinking about, as Brent was saying, like we have an annual goal, we're going to have these benchmarks, and you're going to be continuously collecting data on these, right? And progress monitoring. We can also vary prompting levels and thinking about the criteria that we're going to be using. So those are two areas of the goal that we can adjust. And so just as a reminder, Bloom's taxonomy could be helpful here if you want to advance the next slide, Brent. Bloom's taxonomy could be helpful here in terms of the actions that we're expecting, right? And so we think about this in terms of higher level thinking questions, but higher order thinking tasks as well. And so, you know, what might we be asking students to do that is both observable and measurable in a different part of the goal, right? And so is it a verbal recall like we were looking at in one of the examples, or is it evaluating, right? Or where are we? And that can help us as well. Again, thinking about observable, measurable, and progress monitoring. And so here's an example, right, of a IEP goal with a lot of the different components, or all of the different components that we're going to be thinking about as we talk about what makes for a good strength-based IEP goal. And so let me just read this goal first. By November 2020, when given a second grade text in his general education classroom, Franklin will be able to retell the story and explain the main idea with one verbal prompt from the teacher, or appear on 8 out of 10 opportunities as measured by teacher-created data sheet. So I'm already wondering, right, on the IEPs that you have seen, are the goals that specific? Are they that clearly articulated, that they have all of these pieces? And some of the pieces that we're looking for, so we saw that come up, right? The who, the audience, Franklin in this case. The behavior, as they term it, or the observable act. And so in this case, that's retelling the story or explaining the main idea, right? What is the student going to be able to do? The condition. And sometimes this piece is missing, I've noticed in goals, right? When given a second grade text in his general education classroom, some important criteria there, the condition in which they need, the degree or criteria to which we're expecting the student to perform to have met this goal. And so 8 out of 10 opportunities, and the date by which they're expected to complete it. So in this case, November. Also here in the degree and criteria, 8 out of 10 opportunities, but you see the progress monitoring built in there too, right? So measured by teacher created data sheet.
One thing I want to add here is oftentimes teachers will say, and when we do PD in Jersey, they'll say, well, we only have a drop down menu and we have a goal bank. And I say, well, ask your administrator if you can edit. Oftentimes you can. And so you might get a general scope and sequence from the goal bank, but then you can tweak, you can edit that option through IEP Direct or whatever your district platform is. And you can throw in some of these measurable criteria. Right. And then this is A, B, C, D, E in our article, which Judy has linked here in the chat. We use SMART goals, which is the same sort of idea where it's another acronym for measurable goals. So we won't go into much about this, but if you are interested in benchmarking your goals, we have some of this in the article. All right. So moving on with the action plan meeting. So again, we're talking about a sequence of events. So doing a person-centered plan for a new student, then that's going to give you information to then write a strength-based IEP with measurable IEP goals that are benchmarked, right? So the next step would be then, how do we set up, again, proactive measures to support students in this format, right? So all these tools, remember I said, like a well-oiled machine when used together, kind of present transparency and really best, and like what have we found to be best practices. And so the next piece would be setting up an action plan meeting, right? So you have your MAPS meeting where you learn about the student, you write the IEP, and then you implement it, but you have to check in and see how you're doing. And so one thing we do, and I'm a professor in residence at Bow Elementary in Glassboro, and we've implemented action planning meetings, and we've done them remotely now through COVID. And so what I want to call to your attention as a tool is, in the article, if you go to the very back, the very last 2 pages, you'll see 2 appendices, Appendix A and Appendix B. And if you wanted these in Word format, I have them in my computer files. You can send me an email if you didn't want to like have to retype stuff. But really, with the Appendix A, it's just an introduction to parents about what your philosophy is about proactive supports for inclusive education. Action plan meetings catch smoke signals before things either crash and burn, or they help you, you might be like, everything's great, how can we maintain this progress? And so what I usually do is, the very first day of school, I would send this letter out and say, you know, dear family, what we do here is proactive supports for inclusion. They're called action plans. They're usually 30 minutes to 45 minutes. We're not hugging it out. This is we're checking in with the team. General ed, what's going well, what needs more support? Special ed, what's going well, what needs more support? Paraprofessional, if they can be there, what's going well, what needs more support? It's very much a check-in. How can we fine-tune this? And then we give parents choice if possible. You know, what days work for you? At my elementary school in California, we had a minimum day every Thursday. And so my Thursdays were divided into back-to-back action plan meetings pretty much all year. And these action plan meetings started the year where we checked in with everyone. They served as pre-IEPs, so we had them a month before the IEP was due. And then for any sort of like triennial evaluation, they can serve as that. Parent-teacher conferences count as this. And it's really just a pause where we say, how's it going? Because sometimes passing in the halls isn't effective, because I'll be like, hey, Michelle, how's so-and-so doing in class? And you're like, I don't know, I have 15 other things I'm thinking about right now. And this is just a way to get people moving and shaking together. And so this is just a sample letter that used in my classroom in California. And once you get information back and you schedule the action plan meetings for the year, this is just another sample template. This is the student, this is my information, this is who's on the IEP team, these are the dates of our meeting. And again, I would always try to be first so that I can get all these dates on the calendar for the whole year, so people can't say, I didn't know about this. I'll be like, nope, you got it in August, or you got it in early September. And then this would go in the CUME file, right? And again, these are just ideas on how to set this up. You have templates here. If you want Word docs, shoot me an email. But the idea is that you think through this, even if you do this with one student. We did this remotely with COVID. And what this really looks like when we do it remotely is, hey, here's our meeting minutes, and it has every stakeholder, special ed, general ed, paraprofessional, parent, student, if they want to contribute, and what's going well, what needs more support. And people just fill it out. And if OT can't make the meeting, they shoot me an email and say, Brent, can you please report these things that are going well and these things that need more support? And I cut and paste into an agenda and we share it out. So you can do these virtually relatively easily. We just did that in light of COVID. But again, we just wanted to give you some ideas about once you write an IEP, what are some structures that maintain that momentum of proactive supports rather than doing reactive sort of band-aids on gunshot wounds. And so that's what action plan meetings can look like. And they're just episodic throughout the year, checking in on students.
I just want to mention to that point too, like, so in Brent's example where he had that sort of release time for that, I didn't have that specific kind of time available. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it. Team meetings were a part of the personnel supports for all of my students on their IEPs. And so that created a required opportunity for us to meet as well. And one of the things that worked really well there was having a designated time once a week in the before school time. So personnel, right, all staff, faculty, staff, administration, everyone's there during that time. So it's not additional time outside. And that just turned into a really powerful time. We would have inclusive team meetings at those times. We would work through teams, we would work through expectations, moving students forward and goals. We could have action plans, we could bring parents in to those conversations. And, you know, every once in a while too, what would come up there, we would schedule a meeting and a parent would say, I have to talk to you about part of the dream or the nightmare, right? And we've laid that groundwork. Just, you know, to be thinking about too, right? I know sometimes time constraints are a realistic challenge, but there's ways that we can work with that. And again, with the prevalence of virtual does present a new opportunity with this. Additional challenges, but additional strengths.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on Michelle's comment. Yes, it does require more meetings, and I would see my Thursdays, my minimum days disappear, but we'd never had a lawsuit. We had successful inclusive practices. We developed into a fully inclusive school through these sorts of procedures and structural supports. And for people who, like I said, it promotes proactive communication. So oftentimes districts will not pay for aides or paraprofessionals to be at meetings because it's extra money. And so if I had an action plan meeting on Thursdays, I would have this agenda printed out on Monday, and I'd give it to my paraprofessional and say, hey, during the week, while you're thinking about things, just jot down some ideas or find time to meet with me, and you can dictate and I'll just type in to the agenda. So if you get into a routine with this, it might sound like more meetings, but in the long run, your IEPs are more efficient. Your triennial reviews are super quick. You're not battling lawyers or advocates because you're, like Michelle said, you're increasing that contact, but it's for a higher quality program.
And it's easier to get everyone on the educational team that needs to be a part of that, for that student to have access to the information, have an opportunity for participation, and for everybody to hear each other. And that was really valuable too.
And you're not putting out fires all the time.
Because when things did get tough, yeah. When things did get tough, and they do sometimes, and when challenges arose, and when things weren't, you know, we were able to address something and try it and then say, okay, we'll come back together and see how that worked.
And you always have a meeting on the horizon, right? You know that there's a time when you're going to dig deeper, and that's important.
Okay.
Righty. All right.
Okay, and so this is a tool called FastFacts. And so you have the tool, a blank template, which is available to you in your folder. And then we also have a completed example. So here's the template, the blank template, looks right, there's a shell there. But we're gonna actually look at a completed example. So same thing. And you're thinking about those questions, right? What are the challenges? How do I need to implement it? Where am I going to start? In my school. And so this is for a student named Angel. And I know for me, right, as a teacher, when I'm collecting tools, as an educator, when I'm collecting, you know, thinking about things that I might use, it's helpful to see a completed sample, or to get ideas, or to verify, oh yeah, you know, that's the way they use that, or that's an interesting idea. And to look at the pieces. And so this is a FastFacts tool. You may have things that your district might be using that are similar, but not exactly. You might have IEP at a glance. So I had those, and what, you know, I found that was helpful in terms of making sure folks on the team knew what was required, but they often missed the strengths piece. Or at least didn't delve into the strengths piece to the same degree. And so I found that pairing those two things was really helpful. And that it could all live here. And so this is a 2-page FastFacts for Angel. right? And anybody working with a student, and you can see that it includes the various domains, right? So whether academic, social, emotional, behavioral, but also specific academic areas. So for Angel, reading, writing, math, spelling. And the way that this is written is very much in the spirit of what we have been talking about. So not only strength-based, but what works, when, with what supports, how is the student able to do, right, what they're being asked to do or accomplish that task in the classroom, what are their interests, what are their needs. And so we're not sugarcoating the needs here, neglecting the needs. We need to be honest about that. In order to best support a student, we have to address their needs, right? But also you can see that the strengths and the interests are the forward of this. And so that's helpful for us in thinking about a student as a holistic student and having that in our minds first. And even the way that the needs are written is, right, copies letters from a highlighted sample with some assistance. Even that is more action based around what works and how that need is met or can be met, or we're working toward meeting it. Uses an eye touch, simplified format of things. And so the needs are around needs for support that help the student be successful and make academic progress in the inclusive setting. Go ahead, Brent, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to make a few comments.
Yeah.
This is one of my former students. We use it with permission. He just graduated high school. So the way that we use this, I had oftentimes had paraprofessionals that were out a lot. And so the itinerant sub would come in right as I'm kind of getting ready to co-teach in the morning. So I'd say, hey, you're here for Angel. This is the teacher, the teacher's name where he's included, the room number. Your breaks are at this time during the day. Some districts don't allow you to have pictures of students. Ours did. This is only internal. And so I'd say, here's what the student looks like, because I don't have time to walk you to that classroom because they walked in right at the bell. And so I'd say, here you go. And then here's a fighting chance at what he likes. Here's what he needs. Here's a bunch of modifications in a folder. When he's in reading, writing, math, again, academic, we're not just saying it's life skills, we're modifying academics for him. And this is what you're expected to do. And there is social skills and life skills because he needed all of that embedded in his day. And also students go to computer lab, PE, library, music, science lab, assemblies, and typically itinerant aides are like, I don't know what to do in any of these settings. So it's flexible. And this also helps with transitions. And I didn't have time to update these all the time. So if I had a new parent, I'd say, hey, would you mind, here's an example of this. Could you please fill out this template and get us started while we're learning about your child? And then I had all my aides update every marking period. Whenever I was doing report cards, they would update these. And that would be how we were fluid, right? Again, it's like benchmarking IEP goals. Everything is always being tweaked, but always current so that we're not stagnating.
And valuing input from all different members of the team.
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes aides are the experts because I'm co-teaching with Angel 3 times a week in language arts, but they're with Angel every single day and they have wonderful ideas. And I'm like, wow, I never thought about that. That's wonderful. So that's the functionality of this. And we've adopted this district-wide at Glassboro. And so it seems to be quite effective. Okay, so the next example we have, and we're winding down here, is like Michelle was saying, being very fluid with how we're changing our goals and always adjusting depending on student growth. Is we have to keep track of this, right? We have an IEP matrix as the next tool. And so I would oftentimes every marking period, as we're saying this benchmarked goal was met, I would cut and paste the next benchmark and put it into this IEP matrix. So every time, if it was a sight word goal, we would take out the goals that were mastered and put in, or the words that were mastered and put in new words. So everything was always moving forward, or if they didn't meet a goal, I would put in the progress notes that Angel didn't quite finish, he didn't quite meet this goal because we need to rethink how we're teaching him, right? So it's our responsibility to adjust how we're teaching. And so having this in a matrix was really helpful. Again, this is one example of an IEP matrix. There's many ways, and I'm sure many of you have different approaches that you use for data collection. What's important to note here is this one fits on one page, or it's one page double-sided. And you have a filled out example. This is from another student of mine. Sorry, Kevin. You'll notice that this example that's filled out is color coded. It's on a pink sheet. Angel was yellow, Kevin was pink. Every Friday, as I would co-teach through different classes, I would be in different classes, different times of the week. And I would, if I was going into Kevin's class, I'd look for the clipboard that had the pink sheet on it, because that should be wherever Kevin is going, because an aide needs to do it, a speech and language who's pushing in needs to know what to work on. This is an IEP at a glance with the goals all right here. So if you're a substitute teacher in a gen ed class and you're like, I'm working with Kevin in math, I know that he's doing 33-digit by 1-digit division problems. It at least gives you a fighting chance. And you have a key at the top. So not met is 1x, partially met is 2x's, met is 3x's, and exceeded is an E. These are subjective depending on who's taking the data. But as I'm going through every Friday and collecting these data sheets, I can do a quick once over and be like, I'm in the gen ed class. I'm talking to the gen ed teacher. I'm like, hey, where's Kevin's IEP matrix? Hey, I noticed here that we're not hitting any, anything with retelling the main idea. Is there any way I can help with that? Are you guys just not working on that this week? Was Kevin sick? Like, this gives me a really quick idea of what's being worked on and what's not. And if something is routinely not being worked on, then we're not honoring the IEP. And so this was a way, it was an informal dialogue. And then it was a way for me to touch base every week. But then if you see the week of, these IEP matrices were ready the first day of school. So from the very beginning of the school year, every week, my student binders had these that would fill that. So if anyone ever came to me and said, show me the data that says that you're making progress, I'd be like, pick your week, we're good. And if something wasn't being hit, if there was 1X's across the board, I'd say, come the marking period, I'd say, we really need to reevaluate this. And I'd present that at an action plan meeting and say, we need to rethink our approach. Does anyone have any ideas? Because I'm kind of out of ideas, right? So this serves as a communication tool, and also, again, transparency. Sometimes we overshoot goals and we're shooting way too high, and we're like, we got to back this up. And so this just provides another level of transparency and justification for your decisions. And it looks like we have an issue with downloading the matrix or accessing the
Trying to address it.
Yeah, so we'll address that. So thank you for letting us know, Shayna. And so again, you have the template and you have this example. Some people say, well, this doesn't work in this format for me. I'm like, well, I don't care. Change it to how you want it to that works for you. For me, it needed to be simple, worded exactly as the IEP was written, so that we weren't like guessing on what the goals were. And it was really easy for me, quick, like, because we don't have a lot of time and there's a lot of paperwork. So I wanted this to be transparent and really easy to maintain. And again, every marking period, we update the goals. And we justify if we haven't met goals, and we move students forward if we can. So again, you can dive deeper into IEP matrices if that's what you wanted to do. If we did a part 3 for this and you wanted to explore something more, then you have examples here. For a part 3, be thinking about these questions, about all these tools that we've been talking about. Why would this be an important practice? Is this happening at my school? What would be the benefits of this? Clearly, there could be challenges for implementation of these. And what might the first steps look like? You might be like, hey, I need to do data sheets, but I can only do it for one student. Like, I need to redo them and rethink them. You might just do this for one student. You might do all of the language arts goals for all of your students. Like, who knows? Whatever your situation is, you might take a fraction of this. So thinking of these questions and thinking of these tools that we've just explained to you, for part 3, what we're thinking is as an extension of this, the content in parts 1 and 2, participants will have the opportunity to apply the strength-based strategies in various ways in their own practice. Participants will choose from a menu of strength-based strategies and actively work throughout the session to apply the concepts, tools, templates to their own practice. This will necessitate that all participants have access to a computer and their respective school's IEP database. Now, obviously, depending on your situation, you might be working in different things. What's important for us to know is you'll be receiving a link from the evaluation of the LRC-South. And so we would like to know from you if one of these or a few of these tools are speaking to you and that you want to explore more. Please make that clear in the evaluation so that as we look at if there's a desire for a part 3 and a desire to dig deeper, we can craft that experience. We can put you into themed breakout rooms, for example, and me and Michelle can rotate through moderating and facilitating those discussions. But we want this to be applied, practical for you. And if there's something that you really want to dig into, it could be anything that we talked about today. That's what we're really kind of thinking for the next sort of session of this. So that's, I don't know, Michelle, if there's more.
No, that's great. I would just open it up for questions, immediate questions. If you had questions about the tools as we went through them, we recognize that was a lot of information. So, if there's something that you would like us to answer or speak to a little bit more that can help you either as a result of this webinar, something you want answered or something that you would like answered potentially before you might have another opportunity to try and use these tools on your own, we're happy to answer those questions at this time. So feel free to drop those questions in the chat. We'll be looking for them, but nope, as Brent said, we look forward to continuing to engage with you if there's a future opportunity.
Brent and Michelle, we don't have any questions coming into the Q&A right now. I feel like you've covered a lot of things as we went along. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to write into Q&A or into the chat discussion has been robust, so it might be where everybody feels most comfortable putting their questions. But I did just want to take a minute to thank you both for all the work you did to prepare today and to be with us on this last day of the academic year. I know you're both very busy. We appreciate you putting this time in now and sharing your knowledge with everybody, all the work and research you've done, and thank you so much for taking that time. And to our participants, thank you for choosing to spend this Tuesday morning with us learning about strength-based IEPs. We appreciate your dedication to what you do. So let's see, we don't have anything else in Q&A right now. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. We do ask everybody, please do complete those evaluations. Let us know how we're doing. And as Brent and Michelle asked, please let them know what you'd like to learn more about and what you might be interested in if we do, if we move on to a third workshop sort of environment. What would you want to learn about? Also, follow LRC-South on social media. There are our handles right there. And our website is here too for you.